My name is Carmen from the Center for Learning Enhancement and Research of the CHK. In this presentation, I will talk about a university-wide study on online teaching and online assessment in CHK and the lessons we learned from this special and unexpected experience during the COVID-19 pandemic. First, let's talk about the background of the study. In Hong Kong, we had the first wave of the pandemic in late January. 17 years ago, Hong Kong experienced a very painful loss from the SARS outbreak. For this reason, everyone was very cautious in the beginning, and our university quickly announced that all physical classes would be canceled, and we had to switch to fully online teaching and learning starting in mid-February. Like many other universities, Zoom was selected to conduct the synchronous online lessons. So it was like we only had 2 weeks to learn how to use the Zoom functions, and we designed the learning activities to make them fit for online learning. As the pandemic continued to develop, we also need to cancel all face-to-face examination in May and administer online examinations or other forms of e-assessment. As a central teaching support unit, our center had to respond very quickly to ensure that students and teachers adapt to the new practices. Looking back, it was a very hectic period for everyone. Within weeks, we prepared various guidelines to suggest technical and pedagogical solutions for Zoom lessons, project exams, non-project exams, etc. In this picture, you can see that we tried to demonstrate how to invigilate an exam using Zoom. So this student is taking an exam at home, and we instruct her to set her mobile phone next to her desk as an extra camera to capture herself, her surrounding, and her laptop screen. Besides written guidelines, we also organize many workshops to interact with teachers, to listen to their concerns and answer their questions. The picture here is the eLearning website teachers and students can go to find the resources and tips they needed. Although a lot of immediate support was provided, it was unsure that how well students and teachers adapt to all these new changes. Therefore, we initiate a study to find out. We also want to understand how effective online teaching and learning was from their teachers and students' perspectives, and how satisfied were they with the new experiences. Lastly, we need to find out what difficulties they encountered so that we can promptly pinpoint these problems and help teachers to solve them or provide suggestions or alternative methods to make things easier. The methods we used in this study was teacher and student surveys and group interviews. For the interviews, we conduct them during July and August. 36 students and 19 teachers from all faculties represented in this study. As for the survey, we conduct the first round in mid-February. It was the first week of online teaching implemented in CHK. The purpose was very clear. We need to figure out whether everything was okay with the use of Zoom in conducting virtual lessons so that we could make quick actions in case something went wrong. We also include some open-end questions for the respondents to share what they think about the strengths and weaknesses of Zoom and what support they need the most. Survey response was very good. We collect almost 2,000 responses from students and about 380 responses from teachers. The second round was conducted during May and June after the final exam. Questions in the second round were similar to the ones in the first round, but we added some questions regarding online assessment too. Let me give you a quick overview of the respondents' profile. What you can see here is the results from round 1. Students from all 8 faculties were represented. Faculty of Business Administration was the biggest group, while the Faculty of Law was the smallest group. Around 80% of the participants were undergraduate students and local students from Hong Kong. I would say that this distribution was similar to the student population in CHK. As for the teacher respondents, again, all faculties were represented. Due to the time limit, I don't go into details to the respondent profile of the round 2 survey because the distribution was actually quite similar. Then we looked into the usage of different Zoom functions by students and teachers. In the first teaching week, only about 60% and 35% of the students used the breakout room function and the raise hand function respectively. When asked whether the breakout room was a good learning experience, student opinions was about equally divided. What's interesting here is that over 90% of the students used the chat function. As reflected in the written comments in the survey, many students reported that they felt more comfortable to raise questions or interact with their peers using the chat room because they didn't need to show the faces or reveal their identity. Some even wrote that the learning environment became even more active than in traditional classroom with the discussion in the chat room. As for teachers, similar to student response, they use chat quite frequently to answer students' questions. However, only about 40% and 55% of the students use the interactive functions in the virtual lessons, like the breakout room and poll functions. Not many teachers use that. To conclude, during the first week, it seems that interactive elements were quite insufficient. So what happened in round 2 when students and teachers went through weeks of online teaching and learning? Gladly, we see an increase of usage of interactive functions in both students and teachers. For students, both usage of breakout room and raise hand function are increased by 20%. For teachers in round 2, almost 70% of the teachers use poll to check student understanding or prompt their thinking, and about 60% of the teacher now use breakout room to facilitate group project or discussion. In addition, for those teachers who used these two functions, about 70 to 80% of them agreed that these functions were facilitative of teaching. All in all, it seems that teachers and students gradually adapt to online teaching and learning situation, and we're getting better at it. Another question we had was whether students were engaged in learning in virtual lessons. In round 1, only a quarter of the respondents reported an increase in level of attention and participation. About 60% reported that there were no increase in level of attention and participation. However, it could mean that their attention and participation level stayed the same as in the traditional face-to-face learning, or it could mean that their attention level dropped. As for teachers, 1/3 of the teachers disagreed or strongly disagreed that students were more attentive in virtual lessons. Close to half of the teachers disagree or strongly disagree that students ask more questions in virtual lessons. And nearly 3/4 of the teachers were neutral about whether students were more engaged in the breakout room session. It appeared that student engagement was not very good in the first week. As reflected in their interviews with teachers, one of the biggest challenge was that they couldn't know whether students were paying attention or even there when most of the students turned off the camera and went silent completely. That may be one of the reasons why many teachers respondents chose neutral to these statements, because they had no clue what was happening in the other side of the computer. So did things get better in round 2 when more interactive functions of Zoom were used by teachers and students? To the students side, we didn't see much difference. The result in round 2 was quite consistent. Most students didn't experience an increased level of attention and participation in virtual lessons. But interestingly, the teachers perceived that student engagement was better than that in round 1. Although fewer respondents agreed that they were more attentive in virtual lessons, but more of them agreed that students asked more questions and were more engaged in breakout room session. A quick conclusion can be made here is that it takes time for students and teachers to get familiar with and get better at online teaching and learning practices and strategies. However, as we find from the written comments and in-depth discussion in the focus group interviews, it was really hard to keep students engaged in purely online settings, and that online teaching cannot entirely substitute traditional face-to-face teaching in long term. As for learning effectiveness from the student point of view, close to half reported no to the statement Zoom has enabled me to learn effectively in both rounds of surveys. More students in round 2 agreed that Zoom enabled them to learn effectively, but the increase was only about 4%, and it was not a very statistical difference. So how about teachers' perception? Did they agree that Zoom enabled them to teach effectively? Well, it appeared that there was a gap between teachers and students' perception of the effectiveness of Zoom lesson. In round 1, agreement to the statement was considerably high, with about 60% of the teachers agreed or strongly disagreed. But then after a whole term, the agreement dropped to 44.4%, nearly cut by 20%. It was difficult to tell why the perceived effectiveness dropped, as teachers had more familiar with the online teaching strategies or approaches. Comparing the written comments in 2 rounds, we speculate that in the beginning, teachers were very impressed with the Zoom functions, that they were still be able to deliver contents to students in real time. Some teachers reported that Zoom was a good substitution when face-to-face lectures were no longer possible. However, as time went by, the teachers could see more limitations of Zoom lessons, such as weaker connection with students, weaker attention level of students, etc. So therefore, then it may be the reason why the perceived effectiveness dropped in round 2. In terms of satisfaction with the use of Zoom in online learning, in round 1, about 40% of students were highly satisfied or satisfied, and then 30% were unsatisfied or highly unsatisfied, and then about 30% were neutral. Opinion was similar in round 2. For teachers, almost 70% was satisfied or highly satisfied in round 1, but then the satisfaction percentage dropped to 51% in round 2, which was consistent with the responses about teaching effectiveness. So the COVID-19 outbreak was very serious, especially in March in Hong Kong. So our center started to prepare teachers and students for online assessment immediately. We tried to convince teachers to use open book or non-invigilated exam to replace traditional closed book invigilated exam, because effective portering solutions didn't seem to be good enough. However, some courses, especially for medical courses, closed book exam were very hard to replace. Moreover, changing the whole assessment scheme is a big move. So we were not surprised to see that about 1/3 of the student respondents reported that they had invigilated online exams in round 2 survey. And then Zoom was the most commonly used software for portrait online examination, followed by Respondus Lockdown Browser and Respondus Monitor. We heard cases that some exam made use of Zoom, Respondus Lockdown Browser, and Respondus Monitor altogether to avoid any cheating behaviors, and actually went quite well and smooth according to the teachers. So that was very interesting. And then only 28% of the respondents felt satisfied with the software used for the portal exam, despite the fact that the majority regarded that the online examination were quite smooth or very smooth. So apparently the problem lies in the issues of fairness. Less than 30% of the respondents felt that online assessment was a fair way of assessing what they learned, and nearly 80% was in agreement with the notion that cheating was more common in online exams. To conclude, the study shows that the transition from in-person learning to online learning was smooth in general, although student perception on learning effectiveness and their learning satisfaction was not very high, as shown in the survey. There is still a cause for optimism. For example, many students from the focus group interview expressed appreciation to the teachers for making a lot of effort to keep them engaged and feel connected. However, there are many challenges to overcome. First, it was the technical problems, including unstable network, software errors, and not having the suitable device for learning. For example, some students reported in the interviews that their home had only one computer and it was used when the computer was used by other siblings, they had no choice but to use a mobile phone to attend the virtual lessons. Imagine how exhausting it could be to look at a tiny screen for hours every day. Moreover, Hong Kong apartments are very cramped and most students do not have the luxury of owning their own room. So many complained that they didn't have a quiet place to study and therefore were constantly distracted. And then there were technical pedagogical problems, especially involved with lack of interaction and communication. And then third, it was the psychological problems. More than 54% of the teacher respondents agree that inexperience in online assessment created additional stress to students during the final exam period. A number of students in our focus group interviews said they felt especially isolated and stressed after a few weeks of online learning and find it more difficult to motivate themselves to keep up with the studies. So how can teachers address these challenges and help teachers learn better in online environments? From the written comments by students and the interviews, we summarize a few things teachers can do to make things easier for students. Firstly, you can consider uploading your course materials in advance of your virtual lessons. As mentioned, some students don't have the ideal learning environment and may get distracted by their surroundings. So if you upload the materials in advance, they can prepare and then ask for clarification during the lesson time. And then moreover, most students experience disturbance and disconnection during the virtual lessons. So they appreciate if teachers provide recorded lectures as far as possible. And then recorded lectures were also considered to be very useful resources for reviewing contents, for unclear points, and for exam preparations. Lastly, students said that the online office hour provided by their professors was very helpful and hope that more professors continue to provide these extra sessions in which students can ask questions relating to their courses. So lastly, from this study, I have 3 messages to share. The first is that interaction isn't just between teachers and students. I mentioned earlier that students become more stressed during the online learning period. The same happened in teachers too. They worry that the limited eye-to-eye interaction undermine the learning experience and effectiveness. After talking to the students, it could not be more apparent that students value their direct interactions with teachers, but they also said that they had more opportunities to learn to be independent learners in this period. And they also enjoyed the discussion in chat boards and discussion forum with their peers. So what really important is the connection between teachers and students, then with each other, then with the material, then after class with the material again. So good interaction keeps going, just some of them happened out of class. The second message is that meaningful interaction doesn't need to be verbal. I think it's about time for my presentation. So let me wrap up very quickly. So meaningful interaction doesn't have to be verbal because as I said, the chat bots in the virtual lessons, they usually have some very interesting discussion. So try to incorporate a online chat box or forum in your class to collect thoughts and questions, and interact in meaningful interaction may start from there. And the last message is that blended mode may be the new normal. So we should all prepare for this. So I think I used up all my presentation time, and I'm sorry for my poor time management. If you have any questions, you can leave them in the chat box, and I am very happy to answer them. Or you can email me for the questions about this study. So